Hello everyone, Ryan Hassan here for this Facebook Live, busting 3 myths about trauma. I'm joined by Matt Nettleton. Matt, how are you today?
I'm good, thanks, mate. How are you?
I'm good. We've got a bit of a new program we're using for this Facebook Live, so if there's any glitches, let us know in the comments, please. um, Today we're going to try and not be too long with this live. We want to be short, sharp, and succinct, and we want to get through these 3 myths that we want to bust today. I can see the comments here. If you have any questions along the way, please just pop them in the comments, and we'll do our best to get to them and answer any questions that you have. And we might leave a little bit at the time at the end to answer some as well. But don't hesitate to jump in with any questions. It'd be great also to hear where you are watching from today, whereabouts in the world you are. We always like to know that, and then we will start to jump into things. Myself and Matt, if you haven't seen us before, have our own history with trauma, mental illness, addiction. We've also been trauma therapists now for years, and we have created a modality called embodied processing where we start to training other practitioners or people that are really interested in this space around how to, through the body, start to process a lot of these constrictions, traumas, undigested life experiences, these things that we all have to varying degrees. Unfortunately, in this new software in the comments, I haven't got people's names. It just says Facebook user. So um, we've got someone from Melbourne, someone from Adelaide. Fantastic. It's great to see you. Like I said, jump into the comments if you have any questions as we go along. If you are catching the replay, then just put hashtag replay and you can ask any questions in the comments and we will get back to them as soon as we can. This video will be live in the group not too long after we finish recording it. Melbourne in the sunshine. Beautiful. It's the time of year we need sunshine down here. Some of that vitamin D. All right. Let's get into it. So let's bust these 3 myths about trauma, a topic that myself and Matt absolutely love talking about because there's a lot of misconceptions about trauma. And I didn't say that in the heading, these are the 3 myths about trauma because there's a lot more than three. But these are three that sort of come up when myself and Matt are talking to other practitioners or working with clients that, and classically the way psychology and these kind of therapies have thought of trauma, and we're starting to get a lot more information about it. And it's important that we bust these myths so we can start to understand it because we can't change what we do not understand. So, the first myth is trauma is what happened to us. If you look up the definition of trauma, it will say it is a terrible event that happens in a reaction to a terrible event. Um, what we know now about trauma isn't actually the thing that happened to us. A lot of times when we hear the word trauma, we have different associations. We think, okay, well, that's sexual abuse, physical abuse. It's a war veteran who's been away and witnessed and been through horrible things that humans aren't supposed to go through. It's a car crash. And those are the things that we kind of associate with trauma. And those are traumas nearly all of the time. But trauma is such a wider spectrum of that. And it's not just the thing that happened, but it's actually what happens inside of us as a result of some external stimulus. Matt, do you want to jump off and have a bit of a talk about that?
Yep. I was mentioning to you before, it's so weird that we thought of trauma as the actual event because as soon as the event finishes, as soon as the war's over, or as soon as, say, the sexual abuse over, as soon as that event is done, then the trauma's done. But trauma is what we carry with us after that. That's why 40 years later, someone can still experience the symptoms of that event. And so trauma or PTSD, and I don't like the term PTSD with the word disorder because it's actually an adaptation. PTSA, I would prefer to rename it. So post-traumatic stress adaptation. Um, so when an event happens to us, it leaves an imprint within our nervous system, and it shows up later in life as a reaction. So it doesn't necessarily show up as a memory, even though it can, like flashbacks and all that sort of stuff. But primarily for most people, it shows up as an automatic reaction, the way they react or respond to an event. So say in childhood, my mother is always screaming at me, or my dad's always screaming at me. And then 30 years later, I'm in a workspace and my boss is always screaming at me. to get the job done and whatnot. My nervous system has adapted to being screamed at in a certain way because of my childhood. So, say dad screams at me and I contract in my belly and in my chest, and I sort of shrink down into myself as a way to protect myself. It's a survival response. It's a protection mechanism that our nervous system has, highly intelligent, and all animals have them. But what happens with human beings is that stress contraction will then carry and not complete itself. So then later in life, I'm in a completely different situation. I'm an adult who can stand up for myself, and my boss represents my father, and he starts yelling at me, my system will contract in that same way. And so that's what trauma is, what happens inside of us as a result of what happens to us. So we adapt to certain circumstances in order to survive. We have a survival response that happens, and that survival response gets stored in the nervous system, creates an adaptation. So then later in life, we will have those same automatic responses. And I always liken it to an intelligent idiot, because it's extremely intelligent in the moment to have these survival responses, but they carry through life in situations where they may not be needed, where a different response might be needed, but we seem to continue to play out the response that happened in the event or prolonged period of time.
I'll just bring up a little graphic here at the in the middle there at the bottom. So when we start to think about, well, we change our frame of reference from trauma as the actual event that happened to what happened inside of the person. So if we want to get really specific and talk about what exactly happens inside the person, it's these 4 points. And the first one is a nervous system in overwhelm. So I'm sure if you're watching this, you've probably heard of the fight, flight, freeze response, which is basically a survival mechanism whenever we're met with extreme stress. So our whole system, our body, our mind, everything, our being goes into this overwhelm state when we either want to fight back at whatever's the perceived threat is, or we want to flee and run, or we want to completely shut down. And those are different nervous system states. What happens then, we have a lot of emotions involved in that. We think about survival response, we think about fear, but it can also be coupled with many other emotions. There can be deep sadness, there can be deep shame or guilt, there can be massive amounts of anger and rage. We have all this emotional energy that rises up in us. Now, at this point, it's still a potentially traumatic experience, because the truth is we get met with these threats or perceived threats many times throughout our life. The issue is, and Peter Levine explains it very well, it's like a loop. So this trauma loop, this threat, it starts, and then ideally we find some sort of resource of safety, okay? Without getting too much into polyvagal theory, a ventral vagal response, some sort of resource which helps that traumatic experience, that loop, start to close. And we come back to homeostasis, we come back to calm and safe, and our body realizes that whatever the event was is over. Unfortunately, as human beings, we live in a society where we are not very well resourced, and we don't have the tools. Our parents, our grandparents, our teachers, they just don't have the knowledge that this is how we start to get past these potentially traumatic events. So what happens, that nervous system never finds completion. Think of like an animal, a gazelle. It's a really good example. The gazelle's sitting there munching on some grass in the field, perfectly calm and at ease. And then the lion jumps up and the chase is on. And it's literally life or death for the gazelle during this chase with the lion. It is in a massive flight response. What happens, let's say that gazelle gets away from the lion. Okay, then all of a sudden the threat is gone. Okay, and the gazelle can then go back to munching grass in quite a relaxed state. It may not go back to the same place to munch grass in the future, because that's how it learns, but it's come out of the massive stress response and it's happily munching grass again. Because fortunately for the gazelle, it doesn't have a psychological self that it's trying to defend and conceptualize all the time. Us human beings, we're a little bit more complex, and oftentimes when we get stuck with that loop, we can be metaphorically looking over our shoulder for a lion for the rest of our life from that point forward. And that can be happening with a number of different situations. What happens then, once we have that emotional energy stored or blocked within the system and our nervous system never finds completion or safety, we start to create what we call painful narratives, which are beliefs, thought patterns, ways that we see ourselves and the world that actually limit us from feeling connected and feeling safe. That can be that voice in the head that says, the world's a scary place, I'm not worthy of love, I'm not good enough, I fear conflict, I don't trust men, I don't trust women, I don't trust myself, there's something inherently wrong with me. These are very, very painful narratives that limit our space for connection as a human being. And then the final part is this orphaned part. So basically, we take this version of us, this internal state which represented what happened externally, and we kind of push it out here. Okay, that's what we mean by orphaning. We kind of take it out here, and we do that for two reasons. Number one is because it's so incredibly painful what we went through, whatever it is, that it's a little bit less painful if I dissociate and put it out here. We were taught at a very young age in this culture that, whenever we feel uncomfortable emotions, get away from them as quickly as possible. That's led to a culture of distraction, of immediate gratification, of addictions of all sorts, because we don't know how to actually sit with these uncomfortable emotions and sensations in the body, so we can push them out here. The second reason we push them out here is so we can keep an eye on them to an extent, which means that, let's say that there was a perceived physical threat. I remember I was under threat of bullying in primary school by some high school kids. And I remember that was an unclosed loop for me, a trauma. And I remember being a 30-year-old man, like 6'2", 100 kilos. And in certain situations, I would start to still feel scared, like that little kid in primary school being potentially bullied by people bigger than him. So by keeping my eye out on this orphan part, it's kind of going to try and protect me from something similar happening in the future, even though it's decades later and that threat isn't actually real.
Yeah, and for a lot of people, these things go unconscious, so we're not even aware of them, and they can show up, say, symptomatically as depression, total shutdown, disengagement from life. It can show up as low-level sort of garden variety anxiety, where there's just this anxious feeling that's always there, something's
The
wrong.
hum.
Yeah, the hum, like a hummingbird that's just, and our nervous system's just in a really low-level fight-flight state, or it can show up as laziness, which can be like a fawn or freeze, just a sort of a real subtle shutdown, like I said, disengagement, or it can be like on the chronic end of these. And so these are the symptoms, these are what we see, and these are primarily what we've been attempting to treat, the symptoms. But it's like cutting a branch off a tree and watching it grow back somewhere else, and it comes up as addictions, as different mental health disorders, like borderline and all of that sort of stuff. And it's a nervous system that is dysregulated, that never found homeostasis again. And so a healthy nervous system, we're able to connect, we're able to engage in a healthy way, we're able to be ourselves, we're able to say no, we're able to set boundaries. All those sort of things can happen effortlessly. But when our nervous system is dysregulated and we're attempting to do all these things, we're going to hit walls. We're going to hit blockages. We're not going to be able to do it. It's going to take a lot of effort, and we'll probably exhaust ourselves trying to make it happen. And we can actually become further dysregulated, because what we're doing is we're overcompensating, going up into our minds, trying to create this sense of self. But the whole nervous system, so the whole root system on the tree, is rotting. So it needs to be worked with on the somatic level within our body, within our soma. So these stress contractions that, say, happen in childhood or later in life from an acute event, or sort of our developmental years. And I'm under the view that everyone has developmental trauma in the West, or the very rare few, would have not been parented in the way that we encourage to parent in the West. And so this stress, it's stored survival stress, it gets trapped in our nervous system and goes unconscious. We orphan it. And then anytime we're in a similar situation later in life, it will come to the surface and run the show. That's what trauma is. It's a recycling of these traumatic loops that never completed themselves. So at the end of an event, it's like the exhale. It's over. My whole being just relaxes. It's done. We don't get that. Say I put my hand up in class and I ask a question, say I'm in grade 1 or grade 2, and everyone laughs at me, and I get a big shame response, which is a shutdown response. And everything in me contracts. And then I'm told to, go distract myself or get over it or whatever, if I start crying, everyone sort of laughs even harder. That stress that's held in the body doesn't complete. And then, say that happens on a regular basis in different situations. And then that might go on to develop social anxiety. So I get all these beliefs like it's not safe for me to be myself, don't ask questions, rah, rah, rah. And then I go to ask a question, or I get an impulse, I have a question come up. Instantly, what I'll do, shut that down. It's not safe. I'll get that same stress contraction come up in the belly 10, 20, 30 years later. that says it's not safe to do that. Because there was a threat to my sense of self in that moment. A threat to my connection, to love, to my attachments. Those were all threatened by my silly question that I asked in grade 2. And so everyone experiences trauma to varying degrees. I see, you know, anything where that does a stress response that doesn't complete itself, and there's a view that it's only ones related to survival, but I see it as also related to survival of our identity.
Yep.
So it's not necessarily, it doesn't have to be a physical threat where there's a gun to our head or a snake or a tiger running at us. It can be a threat to our sense of self also that creates this stress. It's like a balloon that builds up and up and up and up and up, and then pop. We've got chronic panic attacks and anxiety. Like I've been watching The Sopranos, and sort of like, he's going to the psychiatrist about these panic attacks that he's having, and then he's talking about his mother and his childhood. It's like the panic attacks symptomatic of developmental trauma and this stored stress in his system. And once you start to really grasp this sort of model or this blueprint that we're speaking about of trauma and what it is and how it affects our nervous system, we start to see its symptoms everywhere. It runs our culture. It runs our society. I was watching another show called The Minimalist, where it's about getting rid of all excess things. And they talk about the addiction we have in our culture of buying things, seeking fulfillment, and all of that sort of stuff. And it's like, that's a survival adaptation. It's symptomatic of a cultural wounding, a cultural trauma that we carry. And, so me and Ryan, we created EP out of all of our study. We know trauma like back to front, and like we've done many, many sessions with clients, and you start to really understand and start to see what's running the show. When someone's got a dysfunctional behavior, the behavior is coming out of a deeper wounding. And so we developed EP to work with the root systems, to learn to come down into the body. So we've been dissociated as a culture from our bodies, from the stress that's stored in our bodies. Having to work 9 to 5 is stressful on the nervous system, but no one has developed or been taught a way to be with the stress in the body, to clear the stress out of the body. And so what happens is it accumulates. It accumulates more and more and more and more and more, and then everyone's on medication. It's less people off medication than people on. And so what we did is we developed EP as a way to learn to safely come down and start processing the stress in the body, the traumatic memories, the imprints that are held there, the emotions of shame, rage, anxiety, terror, all of those sort of things, but also develop a lifestyle for our clients and the people who are doing the course, because this training is for people who also want to deepen themselves into their own healing, is to develop and grow in a capacity to safely feel our feelings that are held in the body. So then we're not accumulating this stress, we're actually processing it. We're shedding the layers of the onion that created this false sense of me, of self, that is based on pain. This false narrative and this false felt sense of who I am. It's not really who we are, it's an adaptation. It's covering up who we are, and we had to cover up who we are in order to survive.
So true. So true. So this brings us on to the second one. It kind of leads in really well. The second myth is, what is traumatic for one person is traumatic for everyone. This once again comes kind of from the same belief that it's the thing out there that happens. And when this myth, where it runs people into a lot of problems is we start to actually downplay our own experience, because we always feel like, well, we haven't been through anything as bad as this other person does. And we start to compare our history, compare our potentially traumatic events and that kind of thing, which is a terrible thing to do, because it robs us of honoring our direct experience of what's showing up in our life right now and where those behaviors that we want to change come from. And so, it's probably worth touching on here, the different types of trauma. And Matt and I talk extensively about this in our training, but it's acute trauma, which is kind of what we're talking about with the, sexual abuse, physical abuse, war, car crash, that kind of thing. That's acute trauma. That's one category of trauma, and it's very, very real. But that's kind of where we've seen the whole umbrella of trauma, up until just recently. But there's other categories. Matt spoke about developmental trauma, and I completely agree with him. Like, yeah, most, if not all, of Western culture has some degree of developmental trauma. It just shows up in different ways. It can show up as this addiction to work, which is kind of a socially acceptable coping mechanism. It can show up as drug addiction, which is a less socially acceptable coping mechanism, but it comes from this same kind of internal drive. So developmental trauma is rife, and we have acute, like I said. Pre-conscious or pre-cognitive trauma, so big. We're talking before the age of 18 months to 2 years of age. The recall part of our brain hasn't developed yet with memory. However, what happened to us from when we were born up until that point, our body remembers. So if there was threats to our survival, our body retains memory. It's called an implicit memory, so a body memory. And it'll start to adapt and change behaviors and do things in response to whatever was a threat to its survival during that time. Um, you know, I feel like we've come a long way in understanding this early childhood development, but I was reading not too long ago, it was only the 80s. The 1980s wasn't that long ago. It was only the 80s that we thought that babies under the age of 2 years could feel pain. And when there was some sort of operation needed to happen on them, instead of being given painkillers, they were given paralytics, so it would paralyze the body, but you'd still feel pain, to have surgery and operations. It's the most inhumane thing. If you like, the definition of trauma is that, and we were doing it to our kids up until the 1980s. So we have pre-conscious and pre-cognitive trauma, which is like held in the body, which just because it's out of memory recall and our hippocampus doesn't mean that we can't access and start to work with these body memories as well. We also have in utero, so in the womb, so much more research coming out now about trauma in the womb. We know that mothers who are very, very stressed during pregnancy, the babies are born with higher levels of cortisol. This isn't to shame anyone. This is but one thing. When you hear this information, we can start to internalize and think about what we've done with our kids and start to guilt and shame ourselves. That's not what it's about. This is about new information that we can start to incorporate our life from today. So we definitely don't want to invoke more guilt and shame, but it's important that this information's out there. So that's in utero. Where genealogical, intergenerational trauma. We dive into that in the course, but there's so much good research out now how trauma is passed down through the genes from our parents and grandparents and even further back. We often, hear kind of see articles maybe that say we found the depression gene, the alcohol gene, and that kind of thing. Nothing like that has been found. It's not that to get passed down through the genes that we know so far. It's these trauma responses that happen during a survival adaptation all the way back. So there's collective trauma, cultural trauma. There's so many different categories apart from this acute phase, and really arming ourselves with the knowledge will help us understand ourselves and the people we love and the world at large a lot better. So Matt used the example of the kid putting his hand up in class, and you'd say, well, that happens to kids all over the world. Does that mean they all carry that as a trauma response? No, there'll be a percentage. It's like, what event will trigger those four things to happen inside that I brought up a little bit earlier? It's very subjective, and there's so many other factors coming into play. How sensitive is that person's nervous system? How much of a resourced and safe environment do they live in? Do they feel safe to express their emotions at home and talk about what happened to them earlier in the day? It's very, very subjective. So what is traumatic for one person does not necessarily mean it is traumatic for another person. It's very, very important to understand that. And it's so important to understand not to downplay our own trauma. Someone, put in the comments before, I totally get the shutting down of my voice. And so we kind of watch our life, and we kind of know, like, because I had that as well for the vast majority of my life. Whenever I would go to speak up and really express my needs, that inclination to shut it down was always there. There'd be massive amounts of fear. So I can kind of deduce by watching my life and watching where I have these contractions, where I'm holding on to some sort of trauma. That opens us up to exploring where that may have come from, and that can be different for everyone. We don't know until we start to jump in and start to explore it. And I'll just bring
Yeah.
up
So
the third point. I'll just bring up the third one here, Matt, and then you
okay,
can
go ahead.
jump
Yeah.
in and go for it. So the third myth we want to bust here is we should just talk about our trauma to help desensitize it. So the main modes of trauma therapy, things have changed in the last 5 to 10 years. Before that, for a very, very long time, the idea was if you keep talking about a traumatic experience, you'll eventually become desensitized to it. Matt, do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, for sure. And I just want to add, to the what's traumatic for one person is traumatic for everyone. It's like that, say, that kid who puts his hand up and gets laughed at, or that kid who gets screamed at by his dad. If they've got no capacity to come out of a stress response and complete that loop, that stress cycle, then it's traumatic. But if they've developed a capacity, have a healthy nervous system, they might contract and then release. But if we contract and don't release, which most of us have no capacity to do, we were never taught to, our parents were never taught to, this has been a generational type of trauma, then what happens is it gets stuck in the system. That is the trauma. That's what happens inside of us. And then we adapt because of that. But so we should just talk about our trauma to help desensitize it. Well, that's of the view that it's a psychological disorder, and it's not a psychological disorder. It's a nervous system adaptation. So I liken talking about our trauma to trying to talk our way into healing our broken leg. It actually does nothing. It actually makes it worse when it comes to trauma because it embeds the trauma in our neurophysiology. So I'll talk about my experience. I spent years in talk therapy, talking about really highly traumatic events. And what happened was I had no capacity to feel the feelings that came up. I had no body awareness to know what was happening in my body. And so what happened? My system shut down. I went completely numb and I dissociated. And I spent years doing that. So what happened is I was practicing dissociation in a sense. I was practicing. I became really good at it to the point I would go to my new therapist, my 10th therapist, and I would just tell this horrific story and I would feel nothing. Nothing would come up. It was complete dissociation. And like really, really horrific things were being spoken about. No emotion, just completely numb. And, like we could diagnose someone as a psychopath because of that. But what the truth is that they're completely dissociated. Their body has gone into such a freeze response to keep them safe from the feelings that would come up because there's a belief if I feel all of this, I might die. And that this was my experience. So talking about our trauma, coming and just telling the story over and over and over again is really, really not the way to go when it comes to trauma. We have to develop a capacity and titrate between being able to feel the emotions that come up in the body. So trauma has to be resolved in the body. If you look at Peter Levine and Bessel van der Kolk, they both agree the body has to know the event is over. And going and talking about it, it's backwards.
Yeah, well,
In
you
a
can
sense.
say,
Yeah.
a million times, look, it happened 10 years ago, it happened 20 years ago, it happened 2 years ago, it's over, it's over, it's over. If the body hasn't realized that it's over, then your mind's pulling one way and your body's pulling the other way. And the body, the emotional body, the nervous system is far stronger than whatever psychological concepts we can create around it. You actually sparked a memory for me then when you were talking about the dissociation. It was when I um, went and visited my parents after shutting them out for so long, and I went and told them what had been happening, and it was, yeah, horrific things. And I remember I'll never forget my dad's face looking at me, and he's like, "Do you understand how serious this is?" Because I was explaining what had happened as if I was talking about another person. It was like robotic. Yeah, so
Yeah.
that's like you were saying, just complete dissociation, like I was talking about someone else. Because for me to be completely in my body at that moment, too painful, too much.
Yeah. Yeah. That's right. And someone asked, so to what level should we voice the trauma, and when does it shift to pushing it down? So like we should always acknowledge what happened, and that might be giving voice to it. But if we're just retelling the story over and over and over and over and over in a psychologist's office or a counselor's office, that's counterproductive. If we give voice to it, that can actually be a form of catharsis or a form of release. But when it's moved past that and attempting to come to a cognitive solution, that's when it just is self-perpetuating. It actually makes the whole thing worse. And so what it requires is for us to step out of the story and come down and process the stress that's in the body. So we get that, it's over. And I'm safe and it's over. So someone said, I learned that after leaving my ex-husband, who was very abusive, having to tell my story over and over and over again, assuming they meant they learned that it's not helpful. So, we can go there and tell the story over and over and over and get really, really activated. And we can have some sort of release because we get so activated that we can't contain the energy anymore. It has no choice but to dispel. But then we go and do the same thing again, and so it becomes a cycle of addiction, really, of trying to find that release. But How do you process the stress in the body? That's a really complicated question. It's actually really, really simple,
These are
but
great
it's really,
questions, though,
really
by the way.
yeah, really, really individual. So, like I would say, learn to be with the felt sense, with the stress that's held in the body. So learn to be with the feelings that come up rather than telling the story over and over again. Learn to come down. And this is why EP, it's a bottom up approach, EP, embodied processing. We created embodied processing to answer that question. How do you process the stress in the body? And, there's 35 plus hours of pre recorded content. There's a process, a step by step process with a flow chart that people use in order to learn to do that, to process the stress that's held in the body, to learn to build safety in the body, to learn to start to feel safe in the body, and learn to be able to feel the things that we couldn't feel in the moment because it wasn't safe to feel. And
And we and
so
we
like
often we do just really
go
we
ahead.
need that the knowledge and oftentimes a helping hand because we talk about disembodiment so much, and as a society we're all disembodied and we're spending the vast majority, if not all, of our time up here in the interpreting and cognizing of life. And that's because being embodied has become too uncomfortable because we have so
Yeah.
much of this trauma, this emotional energy, this dysregulated nervous system that whenever we drop down in here, we're like, oh, this is terrible, back up here. And so there's a reason why we keep popping back out. And oftentimes, once we have the knowledge and also have someone who is skilled to help us with that process, we can start to slowly, like Matt says, grow in our capacity, grow in our sense of safety, so we can start to meet the disturbances in the body more and more, and we can start to gradually spend more of our time with the stress responses in our body. Whereas right now it might be I jump back down, and after 2 seconds I want to jump back out, and that's fine because we're all at.
Yeah.
I was at that point at one point as well. I get it, and so many people are. But then we want to spend 10 seconds there. We want to be able to spend an hour there. We want to be able to spend a day there. And all of a sudden, we can start to purge a lot of these stress contractions by really, really being with them. But it takes oftentimes this knowledge and a helping hand because it can be hard, especially early on. It's a foreign place to be because we haven't lived there for so long.
Yeah. And so, there's like processing the stress in the body requires us to develop an ability to be with it, to feel it as it is. And, like if we do that in unsafe circumstance, then it's going to be re-traumatizing because that stress response won't complete itself. So there needs to be safety, there needs to be a safe container and a resource involved so these loops can complete themselves. Someone just said, yes, this was my experience as well. It wasn't until I discovered and started using deeper, more somatic process to work with my response to the trauma that I was able to process it. That's exactly right. So these stress responses can complete themselves.
Yeah. And that's the thing. It's like it's all very, very unconscious until we are conscious and aware of it. And these loops that we keep talking about, they want to close. Yeah, it's like the Matt spoke about the healing of a broken leg, or if I get a cut, if I get a cut and I just keep it clean, then the intelligence of my body will start to heal that cut. It wants to heal, and it's the same with these traumatic loops. But at the time, we unconsciously kept the loop open because we decided I needed to be on high alert to survive that moment, and that's great because we did survive that moment. But then we fast forward 1 year, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years,
Still on high alert.
it's still on high alert. Yeah, yeah. Like me being the big, 30-year-old guy starting to freak out like a little primary school kid who was going to get bashed. Doesn't make any rational sense because that's not where it resides. It resides in my nervous system, in this old imprint in my body, in my soma, in the body, and that's where we need to start to work to close these loops. And it can be quite daunting early on to realize how many of these loops we have, but you're not alone. Matt and I have still got these loops going on in various areas, and we're so immersed in this work. But it is a path that's worth it because the more and more we start to close the loops, the more and more we are able to sit with ourselves in our body with no distractions, and that compulsion to run away and escape starts to get less and less, and that's our birthright. It's our birthright not to have to reach for anything external to make myself feel okay. And we live in a society where that's all people are doing, and we did it for most of our life. Me and Matt, we're not on a high horse here. We're just coming from a
Yeah.
place of lived experience of reaching for the most harshest substances known to man to try and deal with the agony of being with ourselves in certain moments.
Yeah. So that, the whole process that we created is to develop an ability to be with ourselves. If I was to put it in a nutshell, that's what it is, to develop an ability or capacity to be with what's going on inside of me. It's like if anyone sits in a room alone with no distractions and are left with themselves, most people want to get the hell out of there as quickly as possible. But if we can learn to be with what comes up, the stress that comes up in our body, the emotions, learn to process them, learn to stay with them and be present, what happens is it's like a dredge, it like dredges out the unconscious. And then over time, we start to live a more present and embodied life naturally. Like I used to practice mindfulness, and it was like I would bore a hole through anything I would look at, just trying to be just completely alert and present in any given moment. There's just so much effort to try and stay present. But this is a different process, because what happens is the more stuff we clear out, the more stress that's in our system that's stuck there, like from the past, then we just naturally start to be here without that sort of, I need to be mindful, every single wipe I do and every single footstep. It's sort of like I have to be aware and alert, which is a kind of hypervigilance in a sense, but we start to just rest more here and live more in our bodies. Our bodies start to wake up in a sense. They start to be more alive. There's more energy in the body for life to sort of move through, rather than just trapped densities and contracted energy. It's like the body starts to feel more open and present. And
It is. It's like a night. It's a big deep breath. It's you got to
yeah, it
imagine
is. Yeah.
how much energy it takes to keep all of these things pushed down, and then how much energy it takes to remain hyper vigilant in most situations of life. It's no wonder that one of the main issues that people have is, I need more energy. I need more energy, and we do it by using coffee and other stimulants and that kind of thing. And it's kind of a band-aid fix for a much deeper problem. And that's where I think it's where we're moving in healthcare in general, is we're starting to try and look for what's the deeper reasons why, what's underneath this surface level behavior. Like, Matt and I talk about addictions a lot, and everyone says, "Oh, I want to stop this addiction." It's like, no, no, what's underneath that addiction? What's the compulsion to escape? What's underneath that? And that's the reasons why these underlying contractions and these traumas.
So someone just said, I'm still not understanding how to heal or try to heal. Shrinks want us to talk, but that's traumatic. How do we start doing what you guys are saying? Sorry, I'm not quite understanding. That's okay. So, I would, if we want to just keep it really, really simple, start to look up, say, somatic-based therapies. You can look at embodied processing. There's also somatic experiencing. There's plenty of different modalities that work with the stress in the body. And I would not recommend trying to do this yourself. Work with it. There's plenty of psychologists who are trained in somatic-based approaches. There's psychologists who are trained in embodied processing also. But we have to work with the felt sense of the moment. And if you don't know how to do that, I highly suggest finding someone who is trauma-informed and trained in a somatic-based modality. So start from there. You don't need to actually understand much more than that. Just get focused on somatic-based therapies.
Yeah. Yeah, so true. If you guys, we're going to wrap it up there. I hope we've helped with busting these three myths around trauma. If you're interested in mine and Matt's work, which is embodied processing, it's our big practitioner training, which is 35 to 40 hours of video content, an amazing student community who we love. There's wonderful engagement in there. We're living in this such an online world now, and it has its benefits of being able to reach people from all around the world, but it also has its drawbacks of it can be more isolating than we're used to. But we're trying to really bring together people from all around the world who are really interested in trauma, the human experience, in healing, all of that kind of stuff. And it's wonderful to see people sharing their experience of life, because even though we've people on the other side of the planet, I think, Matt, you talk about in the course that you had might have been a client or a friend from somewhere in Europe, and you're speaking
Yeah,
about that
friend. Yeah.
that feeling of not being good enough. And what did they say? They said, you guys have that there too?
Yeah. There's something wrong with me.
It's like, yeah, we've got it everywhere. It's a human thing.
Yeah.
For those interested in embodied processing, I just put in the comments a link to check out all the course outline and course material. It's our life's work, myself and Matt. And I'll just bring up on the screen here. We've also got a sale on at the minute up until this Sunday, where we're actually offering 50% off the course. If you have any questions, you can shoot myself a DM or ask in the comments, and I'm happy to answer. If it is something you are maybe called towards, a study that you want to undertake this year, then enter EP50 at checkout and it'll be 50% off, and that is until Sunday, like I said. We really appreciate you all joining us. I'm going to sort out this software, so instead of it's saying Facebook user, I can see your actual names. But if we're talking about connection, it'll be a little bit more personal. Everyone watching the replay, like I said at the start, just put hashtag replay. You can let us know where you're listening from and any questions that you have along the way. We've had some wonderful questions in this live. Like, I love the questions and the interaction. So if you're watching the replay and you want to know something further, then just post it and we will get back to you. Someone said, I'd love to do some of your courses. We'd love to have you along for the journey. You can, if you want to find out more, shoot me a DM, Ryan Hassan. I'm available, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you have. But I appreciate all of you, everyone on this journey of trying to work shit out. And justice, it's worth it. It's a journey worth taking. It really is.
Yeah.
And we're going to be going live a little bit more in this group as well. We want to really add some value. So if there's anything you want us talking about in particular, you can just let us know. Hey, I'd love for you to talk about this topic. Whether it's something really specific or something broad, just go for it. Just let us know, and we'll do our best to do a live on that and add as much value as we can. So, much love from me and from you too, I'm sure, Matt. All right, I'll speak to you all soon.